It was brilliant. What was really great was the way it equipped Christians. I added an outreach event, as it's always good to put in practice what we were taught, and it was so positive and encouraging. Welcome, everyone, to another Pep Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast from Solas. I'm Simon Wenham, and we're going to be doing something a little different in this episode. The quote we started with was from Phil Brown, a pastor of Cow Plain Church, on his experience of running a Confident Christianity conference from Solas. So that is the topic of today's discussion. And to hear more about that, we've gone to great lengths to source two very special guests this week, the first of whom is my colleague Gavin Matthews. Gavin, how are you doing?
Fine, I'm not sure special lengths. I think bargain bucket might be more appropriate.
Well, I thought that sounded a bit better, but yes, you're right. Perhaps that was another way of putting it. And it may not surprise you to hear that our second guest is another colleague, Steve Osmond, who's just returned from ministry in Northern Ireland. Steve, how are you doing? Are you suitably recovered?
I'm alive and maybe not so kicking, but alive. No, I'm kidding. I've had a good weekend away in Northern Ireland, and happy to be part of the chat today again.
Fantastic. Well, Gavin, I'd love us to sort of start with the beginning, and perhaps just could you tell us something about why Solas started doing Confident Christianity events in the first place?
Well, we used to do a Solas conference in Dundee every year, in the early days of Solas, and the model there was to have sort of really sort of impressive speakers from around the world and bring people to our event in Dundee. And every year there'd be a different theme, and we go quite a deep dive into ideas and apologetics. But around the time when Andy Bannister took over leading Solas, and don't ask me what year that was in, he kind of remodeled our Solas conferences. And instead of doing a kind of a deep dive into one topic and inviting people to come to our event and travel from around the country to Dundee, he said it'd be more useful to serve the church by taking some practical tools for conversational evangelism sort of on tour around the UK. And instead of asking people to come to us, we should go to them from, the southeast of England, the west of England, north of England, to the islands and the Highlands of Scotland, but take the material to where people actually are. And then you actually reach a lot more people and mobilize a lot more people for evangelism. And the other thing was, in those early conferences, we'd be doing a really deep dive into a different topic every year. And that was really good as far as it went. But actually, what was more important was taking those basic tools for conversational evangelism and making those far more widely available to Christians up and down the country.
Thank you, and also obviously, Confident Christianity is quite a catchy name. Do you know, Gavin, why that was chosen as opposed to something like Apologetics 101 or Evangelism for You or something like that? Do you know what the reason for that was?
Alliteration is always alluring or something. I don't know. I think that it's not an original title. I think there's been various books and other people in other countries have used that title because it really kind of focuses more on the fact that what we're trying to help people to do is to share their faith naturally with friends and colleagues and family, rather than kind of come away with an intro level kind of degree module in apologetics or hermeneutics or whatever it is, because it's really about equipping people for the practicalities, being able to engage with the people that they're sitting alongside at work, or the questions that their kids have, or the questions that their neighbors have, and being able to be a little bit more confident, a bit more articulate in the real world. Catchy title, it works, probably not original, but I think it says, much more about what we're about than, if we called it Apologetics 101, that's not really what we're doing.
And if it's about mobilizing the church, Steve, could you perhaps say something about, is it for particular types of church? So I was thinking perhaps, is it for churches with a big evangelism budget, for example, that are able to run these kinds of things?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really attracted me to Solas a few years ago, and when I was thinking about joining the team, was that Solas works with just about anybody, really. So, if you think about what C.S. Lewis described as the mere Christianity, if you will. So, when I say just about anybody, I mean really, what are like the fundamental core tenets of the Christian faith, a biblical Christian faith, and say, listen, if you're in that camp, well, then obviously, we will happily come along and partner with you as we look to share the best message in the world, and that is the news of Jesus Christ, the gospel. And so, we will happily, go just about anywhere in the UK. I think we've crisscrossed all the way up and down. I mean, I've been east, west, north, south, multiple times, as have you, Gavin. And I know, Simon, you get to tour around a little. And so, yeah, one of the things that I love about Solas is that it's not saying, hey, you have to fit this very tight mold. We're saying, hey, let's have a great conversation. Let's talk about this. How can we best serve you in communicating the gospel? And that's really in the context that people are. So maybe it is a very big church in the city centre somewhere, say maybe in the heart of Edinburgh or something, and resources are maybe not that tight. We can really partner with them and look at contextually what's going on and how can we assist. But at the same time, I mean, Gavin and I have both been to many much smaller churches, smaller rural village churches where there's a good faithful contingent that is week in week out a church of 15 people who don't have a lot of, say, resources in a financial sense. And we absolutely love going there because we're saying, hey, the gospel is for all. So we want those people to be just as equipped in reaching their local communities. And Gavin mentioned, in the early days of Solas and the way the conferences were done, I think it was, hey, here's this conference and people descending from all around, where our heart is really to be going just about anywhere. One of the things I love is that it's got some good flexibility to it.
Mm-hmm. And the range of denominations we work with is ridiculous. I mean, we've worked with various kind of Pentecostals. I think also 7 different types of Presbyterian I counted, earlier in the year. And in the last few months, we've been as far south as, I think, Cowplain in Hampshire and Wick in Sutherland, and countless places in between. It's fantastic to meet the range of people there are in the church, all with a heart to share Jesus with their friends. It's great.
And Gavin, could you say a little bit more about, Steve, you obviously alluded to the fact that there's quite a lot of different churches and you've reinforced that, Gavin. I mean, are they all the same sorts of event, and is it sort of one size fits all, or is there ways in which it's sort of shaped to the church in question?
Oh, it's very much shaped to the church in question. One of the things I love doing is chatting to pastors and setting these conferences up. And one of the conversations we always have is, what are the issues going on in your community? What does gospel work look like in your community? And really helping people exactly where they're. Give you a couple of examples. I was speaking to a pastor of a church in a very wealthy area of Aberdeen. And he said that, well, the biggest spiritual challenge we face in our community is apathy. So what material have you got on engaging the apathetic on? And he's got a whole session on how to engage the apathetic in spiritual discussion. So that was on the agenda there. But they have a church plant they said, one of the poorest postcodes in Aberdeen. And then speaking to the pastor there, he said, well, finding hope is the biggest question that I'm facing in my day-to-day ministry in my community here. So what material have you got on sharing hope with people? So that was on the agenda there. And then later that week, we were speaking to a church, I think it was in Derby, where the pastor had said, well, there's a new mosque opened in our street, literally over the road from the church. Have you got anything on understanding Islam? I said, well, we've got Andy Bannister. He's got a PhD in Islam. So obviously the material on understanding and engaging Muslims was on their conference. So it was very much tailored to the needs of the specific church in question. I mean, we always usually start off with some stuff on conversational evangelism, some principles from the Bible. But then when we get into the guts of the Confident Christianity Conference, it is very much tailored for the specific needs of that congregation, just because there is such variety across the country, as those examples, I think, kind of illustrate.
Thank you. And obviously, if you're tailing them to different churches, I suppose someone might say, well, what can training actually achieve? Steve, I wondered, could you speak into the question of, some might say, look, being an evangelist is for certain types of people, maybe very extroverted people. So actually training is more for that kind of person. So actually, what could an event like this do for most people in the congregation? Isn't it just for a few that are like that?
Yeah, good question. I think that question comes up quite a bit, and my mind goes straight to 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give a defense for the reason, for the hope that you have. And that's obviously one of the classic go-to apologetics verses, coming from that Greek word apologia for defense there. But I think what often that can do is miss the point that it's the the hope is the big thing. So it's like, hey, we want to be communicating persuasively the hope of the gospel. And that call is actually given to everybody. It's not just some select evangelist who feels a very strong calling to do that. Like, hey, the church needs to have their tick the box, have their one evangelist. Sure, you have people who are maybe perhaps more gifted or feel more called, and just find themselves in those situations all the time. Absolutely. But all of us are called to be able to be sharing that hope. And that means not that you need to go off and get a PhD in apologetics, although, hey, do that if the Lord's calling you to that. But it means having good conversations, right? So all of us have conversations all the time. The question is, I think, like, are we having good conversations that lead toward, a step in the direction of a spiritual conversation with people, and then on to opening the door to sharing the gospel? And so that, I think, is really one of the big points of saying, okay, well, what is it that the confident Christianity is trying to achieve? And the way I like to think about it is, we want to give people, or sort of help them take a step in the direction of having good conversations, better conversations, not a fight, not a massive debate, but hey, having good constructive conversations where we can more readily share the faith. And so that means actually learning how to step into those conversations. I think oftentimes we just take it for granted that we're just going to be able to, something will come up and we'll be in conversation. And so one of the great things about that is that we can all learn to be better conversationalists. That means opening the door to conversation, or being able to respond to tough questions or objections in good ways that don't shut down conversation but open it up. And so that, to me, is really, Gavin mentioned at the beginning there how we, at the beginning of the conferences, we'll always try and share something about the practical side of things, practical conversations, and then moving on to specific kind of questions in the context someone is in. And there, I think what you really find is people come away from being with some of the simple techniques that we can teach is walking away with saying, oh, wow, I've heard people say, even if it's not in a sort of evangelistic context, how the training has really helped them just have nicer, better conversations, because it seems like we have those skills. And so that's one of the big things I think that we can take away from it. I could, probably say a lot more about that, but one thing that I think stands out for me a little, and then I'll sort of ask Gavin to share one or two thoughts as well, is that the conferences can really act as a great catalyst in helping churches create more of a culture of evangelism. I think maybe sometimes people might think, hey, we're going to put on one event at some point, and then that'll be it, and we do that for the year. Where evangelism is part of discipleship. We're all, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, you're called to be a disciple, and part of that is being an evangelist, being able to share the hope that we have. And we want to do that persuasively. And that takes actually quite a bit of time. It takes intentionality. And so what the Confident Christianity conferences can really do is help kind of just give an injection, or like a adrenaline shot, if you will, to like say, hey, here, let's highlight this, let's think about this, and help people take, one step in that direction. Yeah, Gavin, I know you probably have
absolutely.
Quite a few thoughts.
And the whole thing about the Lausanne Covenant that says, the whole church taking the whole gospel to the whole world, and that's why you bring people together. One of the things I love is the way that when you bring people together to talk about evangelism, we mutually encourage one another, because there's so many of us find evangelism difficult, and just to be with other people who say, yeah, I really want to talk about my faith, but it's hard, isn't it? Let's do it a little bit better next week than we did last week. And one of the things we never do at Confident Christianity is kind of lay on a big guilt trip on people and make them feel awful for all their evangelistic failures. Yeah. It's not about that at all, because we, the gospel is a gospel of grace, when we are forgiven, even for our evangelistic failures, even for the times when we bottled it and didn't speak well. And so it's not about kind of a guilt trip and making it really heavy, but kind of almost sort of putting our arms around each other and saying, okay, this is hard. How can we take a step forward together as the whole church, taking the whole gospel to the whole world? And that's quite good, I think. I was one pastor put it down in London, and he said, I use Confident Christianity because I want evangelism in my church to be on the front burner, not on the back burner. So he kind of primed the church for evangelism in that sense. And that's quite good to be part of that, actually, because it's not easy. If evangelism was easy, we wouldn't do confident Christianities at all. We wouldn't need to. We do it because it's difficult, but actually we can really help and encourage each other to step forward.
Mm. Yeah, I think one more thought is like that we know and we acknowledge that church life is very, very busy. And so, as you say, it's not a guilt trip, but it's saying, hey, what things can you be doing if, as a church thinking about evangelism? What things could you be doing, sort of looking at the year calendar to just keep evangelism popping up at least onto the radar? And that's one of the things I think the confident Christianities are great for that. But as you said, it's not like to lay some burden of guilt for saying, "Hey, how can we come and help you and
Yeah.
keep evangelism in the sort of the mind of all of the congregation?"
Thank you for listening to the Pep Talk podcast. We hope you're enjoying today's episode. Solas does live events in person in churches all around the country, equipping and encouraging Christians to get a little bit better at sharing their faith. And we've worked from the south of England to the Highlands and the islands of Scotland and all kinds of places in between. If you'd like us to come to your church and do a confident Christianity event, get in touch with us through the website. And now, back to the program.
Gavin, I wondered if do we know what impact confident Christianities have had on people or congregations? Is there any way of knowing that? Obviously, because Solas goes in, does the training, and then might not be back for a little while.
It's hard actually to gauge it, but we do know that pastors seem encouraged and keep inviting us back, so it must be doing something worthwhile. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wasting their precious time and their precious budget on training that didn't work. But I mean, one of the interesting things that I noted was that when Andy first took Confident Christianity on the road, he does this the talk that we often start off with, entitled "How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot," and in that he rolls out 3 questions for opening up or starting or defending yourself in spiritual conversations. And a lady was on holiday, I think, in the Highlands of Scotland, and she got the flight home and was sitting alongside someone. She thought, I'll try it out. She flew back down south and then excitedly emailed the office afterwards to say, those 3 questions, they actually worked. I've struggled to share my faith for a long time, but I've tried Andy's method and it works. So you get kind of like drip feeding things like that coming back in, or the conversation we had, one of our speakers, Dave Hutchings, had on last weekend, in fact, down in Hampshire, where someone came and said, oh, my child tried out what you said in an RE lesson, when turned out was the only person in the whole class who believed that God created the world. And then the teacher said, okay, then justify your belief, and had been to a Solas conference on the Saturday and recited a whole load of the evidence that David worked through on science and faith and the origins of the universe and why belief in God is a reasonable and sensible proposition, and rolled this all out to the amazement of the teacher, who phoned this kid's parents to say, this is amazing. This is, quite incredible. And it also meant that child's faith was built up. The whole class didn't hear the whole gospel, but heard a reasonable and evidence-based defense that the Christian faith makes sense, is coherent, is logical. And I gather that youngster who's now a student is still going on with the Lord and still sharing the faith. But that was a decisive breakthrough for that one young person. Now, clearly, that's not the case for every person who comes to a Confident Christianity event, but there are enough people from churches coming back to us and saying, actually, that was useful. Actually, that testimony we heard from someone who's walked through a particular issue was helpful, because we cover issues, science, suffering, sexuality, other topics that don't begin with S. That's what we would say. But when we work through the reasonableness of a biblical approach and how to articulate a defense around difficult issues, people come away saying, actually, I'm not afraid of that issue anymore. I'm not afraid of the subject of suffering or sexuality or Islam or something coming up. I understand that the Christian faith now makes sense, and I know how to articulate it just a little bit better. And so people go out with more confidence. And if we can do that multiple times across the country, that can only be a good thing.
And some of that is dealing with difficult questions. I wondered, Steve, I mean, is that a part of what is happening at these events?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely one of the big things. Be it questions that we ourselves as Christians maybe haven't thought through that much. I think what some of the takeaways are that I've, after doing many of these things and chatting to people, obviously the goal is we want to be training people to be sharing their faith more readily and better and being able to answer these questions. But oftentimes there are questions that people have for themselves that maybe haven't thought about for a long while. And so much of the feedback off the back of, speaking about, the problem of suffering, problem of evil, or, is the evidence for God's existence or something like that, as Gavin mentioned. The feedback afterwards from people saying, "Oh, wow, they just feel that their own faith has been built up so much, and just by doing that, they feel that they can actually be a bit more on the front foot in terms of knowing, hey, there are very good answers to questions out there." Because I think all too often we just don't know where the answers are, where to find them, what the answers might even be, and so the feedback so often is really, really encouraging in that sense. Just people saying like, "Oh, just knowing the stuff is there is really, really encouraging." I was speaking to a lady recently, and often speaking to family members, I think is one of the hardest things. Family members who aren't Christians, and it just seems quite difficult. And after the training, it was actually a church we've been back to a couple of times. So it was from the last training we did, where it was on the practical conversation side of things, and she had said to me how it always used to just very quickly go to being a fight. This person had lots of questions, and she would try and just answer things as quickly as she could. But with the training, she said how she learned how to actually just ask better questions and actually sit and be a good listener, and how that completely changed the dynamic of those conversations, where suddenly this family member of hers felt that she was actually sitting and taking the time to listen and actually unpack and engage her questions properly. And that almost did more than having the right answer or having a good answer. Anyway, it was that the person felt listened to, and that just by nature that opened up the opportunity for much better constructive conversations. And so that kind of feedback just heard so many times. And I think that's a great first step anyway in the direction of having good conversation.
That's actually an interesting point, isn't it? It does make me wonder, actually, sometimes whether actually families are in a really sort of separate category, aren't they? Often very, very difficult to talk about faith, especially if it's someone you've grown up with, or they've seen you at this point or that point, and might be more cynical. Or, if it's a parent or a child or siblings, it is quite tricky. I was struck. We were at an event where we got to pray with someone about a family member, and that was actually another element that I hadn't expected from one of the events. Someone asked, mentioned a family member, and we were able to pray with them, which was a really precious moment. But just a reminder that these are real sort of discussions going on. I wondered, Gavin, if you might say just a little bit about whether confident Christianities have changed at all through time. I mean, Steve mentioned different questions is one thing, but are they done in a different way now than they were back whenever they started?
Yeah, because when we moved the conferences out of Dundee and around the country, the idea was to be kind of like, take the material to the people where they were. But then we found that different churches have different needs. So the original conferences were long day Saturday conferences, but that doesn't work for every church. So we developed a much more flexible model. So sometimes 3 or 4 churches will get together, huge conferences all day long on a Saturday. Other churches say that's too much for our folks, half a day on a Saturday. So we do half a day. Other churches have said, no, that doesn't work for our model. For instance, if you're in a farming community and all the farmers work Saturdays, not possible. So we might do some evenings, or we might adapt it again for a Sunday. Or one church in Glasgow did it as a Sunday after lunch. They did the Sunday service, had lunch together, and then it was Confident Christianity afternoon. And then we've started to do them more recently and more bite-sized ones with much shorter talks, with much more interaction between, much more discussion. So we mix it, match it, make it fit the people. And the other big way that things have changed is that we're increasingly being invited to do a whole Solas weekend. So if they, booked us for a conference on the Saturday, what sometimes happens is they want an evangelistic meeting as well. So, we've got great evangelists who, like Steve and Andy, and also associates like Dave Hutchings that work with us. Why would you not want to do a gospel outreach meeting when you've got a really good evangelist in town? So when Steve and I were up in Wick, the church up there booked a hotel, and they did kind of a meal and a message thing on the Friday night, and they did beautiful food. And then Steve was able to share the gospel with, I don't know how many people were there, Steve. Was that 70 or 80 folk came in?
Yeah,
and
it must have been.
You spoke as a
One.
blinder, a message you gave that night. It was terrific. And then loads of Q&A with non-Christian people. And then I spoke on the church on the Sunday, where we kind of drew some of the threads together. So, they've paid our travel, so why not make us work when we're in the town? So that's been one other development as well, the development of a kind of a whole Solas weekend, which Andy and Dave Hutchings did down in Cowplain as well in Hampshire 2 weekends ago, they did an evangelistic meeting on the Sunday night, a church service on the Sunday, as well as the conference that we were all involved in on the Saturday. So that's kind of changed. But the principle behind that is really pivoting and flexing to serve the needs of the local church. Parachurch organizations like ourselves are not the biblically mandated thing. The local church is the thing you find in Scripture. So our job is always to serve the local church, benefit the local church. And so we have to be as flexible as we possibly can so that what really matters is that the local church, the body of Christ on the ground, is blessed and nourished and built up. And we'll do whatever we can to make that happen.
I wondered if we could just finish off the discussion with I'd love to hear what you both personally think is the best thing about Confident Christianity, or perhaps a highlight for you, perhaps starting with Steve.
Yeah, I think what Gavin just said there is really, I think the great highlight for me is the flexibility and the heart of being all about the local church. I think that to me it's very, very unique in many ways, for saying, hey, what are your needs? Where are you based? How can we make this work and fit for you? And then the second is the level where the conferences try to meet people, is trying to understand, okay, this isn't sort of some hardcore academic thing that we're doing, like reading a big systematic theology textbook or something. No, this is real questions, real needs, real people. And we very much want to be in that space to make it as impactful as possible. And it works. It really does. I think, can always be better, but I think we're doing some great work. The Lord has blessed us. Yeah.
I've loved meeting people from all kinds of churches all around the country. We get to meet some brilliant people, not just church leaders, but church members who are sharing the gospel in, accountancy firms and schools and councils, or on oil rigs, or in insurance companies, or they're out doing street work or door-to-door work, or doing Passion for Life events, running Christianity Explored or Alpha, and they come with their real-life questions. Some of the Q&A sessions we have on Confident Christian events are amazing. When the questions that come from the floor are brilliant. I have to say, it's slightly intimidating sometimes being on a Q&A panel with the likes of Steve and Andy. I mean, Andy Bannister, when he gives Q&A answers, they come complete answers with footnotes and references.
That's so true.
Seriously, the really good thing is hearing people when they come with their real stories. They might say after one of Steve's talks, "Oh, someone said to me this, that I don't think the Bible's got, there's no good manuscript evidence for it. Is there any evidence that what we read in Scripture is what they originally?" And then Steve will unpack a brilliant answer. Or someone will say, "Oh, I sit across a desk in my firm with a Muslim. How do I explain the Trinity to a Muslim?" And then Andy will unload an answer that's really, really helpful. But it's engaging with people in their real lives, and to say sometimes stand back and just admire the breadth of the church around the UK, the loveliness of the church, meeting good-hearted Christians doing great work. I mean, just brilliant people, and meeting them and working with them is actually a huge privilege.
Fantastic. Well, I think you both summed it up better than I could, but I love the point about both the church and the questions. I remember in one of the events I was at, someone asked about manifesting, and I remember thinking, actually, I've got no idea what I would say about that. But of course, it led on to a great discussion about that and an answer to a question. So, but in terms of reflecting, for me, I'm relatively new to Solas, and I've been quite struck by actually how exceptional the events were. And I don't say that lightly. They're quite different from some. I've been to sort of longer apologetics conferences, and often they can be quite weighty or lengthy talks, and sometimes on slightly obscure subjects. And what I really liked is that combination of being sort of short and punchy, but both encouraging and practical. And also, actually, you both mentioned this as well. One thing I hadn't expected is just how encouraging they are to do them. And it's not just encouragement for the church, it's actually encouraging for us as a team at Solas. I think there is something very moving and biblical about believers sort of being in it together, supporting each other, and encouraging one another. And that was really moving to me. So I do hope all of you listening will be encouraged to consider one. Do have a look on our website. So that's solas-cpc.org. And if you go to events under Confident Christianities, you will see the information there. So please have a look at that, and perhaps pass the information on to your pastor to see if you might be interested in running one at your church. So thank you, Gavin and Steve, for being with us. Thank you all for listening, and do come back in a couple of weeks for another inspiring guest on Pep Talk, helping us share our faith with those around us.